Hello, my name is Tiffany Carter. I'm a research soil scientist at the USDA NRCS National Soil Survey Center. And today, the title of my presentation is Sustainable Soils for a Sustainable Planet. Let's think about our planet for a moment. What are some of the things that you think make our planet beautiful? Now, can you imagine a world without trees, flowers, or any plants at all? A world without plants means there are no animals, insects, or people. Because we depend on plants as a food source. We don't think about what's going on beneath our feet very often, but we're literally standing on a vital natural resource. If you haven't figured it out yet, I'm talking about soil. Soil sustains life. So let's talk about soil for a little while. What is soil? The Soil Science Society of America defines soil as the unconsolidated mineral or organic material on the immediate surface of the earth that serves as a natural medium for the growth of land plants. Okay, so now that we know what soil is, how does it actually form? Well, soil itself is a function of what we call the five soil forming factors. These forming factors include climate, or the long-term weather conditions in the particular area, organisms, or all the living things that are present, relief or topography, parent material, or what the soil is physically derived from, and time. These five factors and the interactions between them are what drives soil formation. At this point, you may be wondering what the soil is physically derived from. And actually, it all starts with rocks. Over time, the rock begins to break down via weathering. There are three primary types of weathering that you should be aware of. First of all, physical weathering, which is the breakdown of rock into smaller particles by crushing, peeling, and exfoliating. Secondly, chemical weathering, or the breakdown of rock through chemical processes. And finally, biological weathering, the breakdown of rock by plants, animals, bacteria, or other living things that may be present in the soil. As rock weathers and soil forms, we can identify different components. Soil can be split into two primary designations, soil solids and pore space. Each makes up about 50% of the total. The soil solids include the mineral fraction and the organic portion, and the soil pore space includes the proportion of air and water that are present. Let's talk a little bit more about the components of soil, starting with the mineral fraction. The mineral fraction of a soil makes up about 45% of the total. And with the exception of organic soils, most of the framework within a particular soil body consists of weathered mineral particles. The larger particles generally come from rock fragments and include, stones, gravel, and coarse sand. The smaller mineral particles are generally classified as sand, silt, and clay particles, and these are often single minerals. The smaller particles are broken down into texture sizes. Sand-sized particles are 2 to 0.05 millimeters in diameter. Silt-sized particles are 0.05 to 0.002 millimeters in diameter. And anything that is smaller than 0.002 millimeters in diameter is considered a clay particle. The structure of a soil describes the arrangement of sand, silt, and clay particles as a 3D shape. The mixture of sand, silt, and clay particles defines its overall texture. Here on the right, we have illustrated particle sizes for reference. The soil texture triangle, also on the right, is used to determine the soil texture based on where they fall on the figure. So, now that we know the mineral portion of the soil comes from weathering, what about some of those other soil components? The organic portion of the soil makes up about 5% of the total. Soil organic matter includes a wide range of organic or carbon-based substances. Some examples would include living organisms, the remains of deceased organisms, and other organic compounds that are produced by the current and past metabolism of organisms in the soil. Because the organic matter is derived from living organisms, there's constant turnover of organic material. This, in turn, serves as an energy source to living organisms and therefore produces additional organic matter on a regular basis. Organic matter within the soil is usually black or dark brown in color. And now that we've finished discussing soil solids, let's talk a little bit about the water and air within the soil pore space. The first component within the soil pore space is water. Soil water is absolutely essential for the growth of plants and the survival of other organisms. The soil moisture regime in a particular soil is often a direct product of the climate and is a major factor in how productive an ecosystem or agricultural system can actually be. Movement of soil water is also a driving force within soil development. Because soil water is never actually pure, the term soil solution is often used instead of just soil water. The other component within the soil pore space is air. Though we're familiar with air, I want to remind you that about half of any given soil volume is actually pore space, and soil pore space is filled either with air or water. As water enters the soil, it actually displaces any air that was present. Therefore, the soil air content is always inversely proportional to the soil water content. How do soils benefit us? Well, there are several ways in which we benefit from the soil. A few key services that the soil provides to us include a source of food, fuel, and fiber, acting as a natural filter for water purification, serving as a pharmaceutical source for medicines and vaccines, serving as a structural foundation for buildings that we inhabit, supporting other organisms such as insects and animals that might be dependent on plants, assisting with environmental nutrient cycling, and serving as a carbon sink or a place in which atmospheric carbon can be stored. So, as I'm sure you've figured out by now, soils are both literally and figuratively the foundation of all terrestrial life. If we manage our soils carefully, soils are a reusable resource, meaning that we can use them over and over again. However, soils are not necessarily a renewable resource. Topsoil could potentially be considered a renewable resource if it can be replenished within a human lifetime. This is a bit complex because often it takes hundreds or thousands of years for soil to actually form. The ability to use a soil truly depends on its quality. Soil quality can be defined as the measure of the ability of a soil to carry out a particular function. And the quality of the soil truly depends on how that soil is managed. Human activity is often the source of reduced soil and environmental quality. Three primary issues with soil quality include compaction, tillage, and erosion. Let's talk a little bit more about these three. The first issue is compaction. Agricultural practices often require heavy tractors and other machinery. When heavy agricultural machinery or big trucks drive over the soil particles are pushed together and pressed down. This is what causes compaction. The compaction of soil particles reduces the pore space in between them. With a reduced pore space between soil particles, it's difficult for water, air, and plant roots to move through the soil. The second issue is tillage. Often, soils are mechanically agitated, mixed, or tilled in preparation for growing crops. While tillage helps production by loosening the soil and incorporating organic material, It also causes a few negative consequences. Tillage damages soil structure by physically breaking it down. Tillage also harms soil organisms by ripping apart some of the natural fibers and networks that may have formed. Tillage can also be a source of compaction, as the machinery used for tillage is often very heavy. Tillage also makes soils more susceptible to erosion by mixing the soil and exposing the soil surface. Speaking of erosion, soil erosion is the next issue we should discuss. Erosion is a little bit different than the soil weathering we talked about earlier. Soil weathering happens in place. Rocks and minerals are broken down, but nothing is actually removed. Well, soil erosion is the process of wearing away the soil surface and moving the surface particles elsewhere. Erosion is either caused by wind picking up and moving the soil particles, or by water flowing over the surface of a soil and washing the particles away. Poor soil management and increased agricultural production has made our soils more susceptible to erosion, nutrient loss, structural instability, loss of biodiversity, and other issues. Ultimately, these factors make our soils unhealthy. Because soil degradation is increasing daily, we have to start acting now to ensure the sustainability of this vital resource. The use of sustainable soil management practices is one of the best ways we can ensure that our soils remain healthy. Sustainable soil management practices focus on using soils in ways that provide the current benefits that we need without jeopardizing the capacity of soils to serve similar functions in the future. The mission of the USDA NRCS is to deliver conservation solutions so agricultural producers can protect natural resources and feed a growing world. But that's not all. Our vision is a world of clean and abundant water, healthy soils, resilient landscapes, and thriving agricultural communities through voluntary conservation. And this is where our partners come in. There are several things that can be done to help achieve this goal. While there are several sustainable soil management practices that can be used, they should be centered around ensuring that the soil is healthy. Make note of the following soil health principles. First, maximize diversity in the soil system, and this includes both plants and animals. Second, make sure you're managing the soil by disturbing them less. Next, keep soils growing throughout the year to feed the soil and keep the ground covered. And finally, make sure you're maximizing that soil cover by following these and other soil health principles. Soil quality and soil health can also be improved by supporting soil biology. Soil biology can be loosely defined as the mix of living organisms in the soil. In general, this includes all the organisms, whether we can see them or not, that are living in the soil. It also includes organisms that spend a significant portion of their lives in the soil. As you can see in the image on the left, some examples include insects, worms, birds, small mammals, bacteria, fungi, and plant roots. The organisms living in the soil can be arranged into what we call the soil food web. And the soil food web is further arranged into different levels. And this shows an exchange of energy and nutrients as one organism consumes another. The soil food web is complex, and the extent of its complexity will vary depending on the ecosystem. However, the soil food web is absolutely critical to several soil functions as it provides several benefits to the soils, and whether that's within croplands, rangelands, forests, or gardens. This is mostly because the organisms within the soil food web support organic matter production and contribute to nutrient cycling. To be a little more specific, the soil food web contributes to several soil functions, including sustaining biological productivity, supporting biodiversity, regulating water and nutrient flow, cycling soil nutrients, filtering and detoxifying soil pollutants, and carbon sequestration, or the storage of atmospheric carbon down into the soil. The organisms within the soil food web also benefit from sustainable soil management practices. And so, the benefits between the organisms involved in the soil food web and the soil itself are mutual. As we discussed earlier, some of the soil health principles and practices can help support biology and the soil food web. As a reminder, some of the land management practices that can provide this support include diversifying cropping systems, using reduced or no tillage practices, ensuring that there is always some sort of ground cover by residue management and or using cover crops, and making sure that you're using the recommended rates of fertilizers and other amendments. By taking on some of these small actions, we can ensure that we protect our environment, protect our soils, feed the world, and help sustain our planet for future generations. For more information about soils, visit us at www.nrcs.usda.gov. Now, let's talk about soil survey. What is a map? Maps are pictures or diagrams that show us where things are. You may have seen a map in a road atlas or maybe hanging on the classroom wall. Maps typically show an aerial view looking down, and they were traditionally shown on paper. However, technology has improved over the years, and now we have smartphones at our disposal, and so we have a map in our hand at all times. What is soil survey? Soil survey is the systematic examination, description, classification, and mapping of soils in an area. Soil surveys are classified according to the kind and intensity of field examination. Soil survey could also be defined as the program of the National Cooperative Soil Survey that includes developing and implementing standards for describing, classifying, mapping, writing, and publishing information about soils of a specific area. But that's a really long explanation. So let me show you what people actually see. Well, they see maps. Just like the maps you may be familiar with, soil surveys started out producing paper maps. The picture on the left shows a traditional map. The map includes several lines placed over a real aerial photo. But soil survey has evolved over time, and now we use computer systems through something called GIS, and that gives us more updated maps, kind of like what you see over on the right. If you'd like to find a map of the soils where you live, you can use some of the information listed here. How do people use the maps and information from soil survey? Well, soil survey information is often used for land use planning. For example, on the left, we have an aerial image from the Web Soil Survey of a local elementary school. On the right, we have additional information that's provided with the maps on the Web Soil Survey. With this map and basic information, I could use to maybe decide where the best location for a new soccer field or a new playground would be. Soil survey information is used by many, so it's important that we keep everything up to date. Updating soil survey has often meant finishing maps, remapping after a dramatic change, or refining the resolution. Sometimes it means repackaging the information we have available, such as this animation of soil color with depth. With this type of imagery, we can see where glaciers were at one point, the old red soils in the southeast, and even the sandhills in Nebraska. But to truly have dynamic soil survey, we need to think in space, time, and multiple possible scenarios. The overall concept is to create a four-dimensional model of soil encompassing area, depth, time, hydrology, and other temporal soil properties. The goal is to capture and visualize the variability and diversity of the soil landscape as affected by management and land use. The combination of these types of data will allow the enhancement of soil interpretation. And some examples of enhanced or new interpretation would be to estimate soil moisture and real-time water availability. In coastal zones, we could look at shellfish, pH, and bulk density estimates. We could also look at surface infiltration and bulk density for land use with MLRA offices. And so as you can see, soil survey is continuously evolving. Dynamic soil properties are another example of temporal data that are highly affected by land use and management. These properties can indicate if use and management decisions, and of course practices, are resulting in desirable outcomes. Soil survey information is also used for ecological site descriptions. For example, take a look at this image. This image shows the MLRA 76 Blue Stem Hills, Katina. While the soils here are within the same general vicinity, there are some obvious differences. Soils on similar surfaces have similar vegetation growing in them. It can also be said that soils on similar surfaces will have a similar response to the vegetation that's growing. And so we put all of this information together into what we like to call ecological sites. Temporal soil properties can be used to maximize the interaction of the ecosystem with the development of ecological state and transition models. Ecosystem services can be addressed with the ecological site and plants database resources to handle interactions between soil and vegetation dynamics, as well as explore other new products and stakeholders. Soil survey information is also used for other projects and initiatives. For example, the Science of Soil Health initiative seeks to investigate the science behind soil health and link concepts to real-world data. The images here show two examples of the Palus soil. Visually, we can see that the perennial grass on the left has a much better structure. It was much more friable, easier to sample, but difficult to get a good volumetric sample for bulk density. This type of initiative will use this and other information to determine what differences can be seen and which field metrics may work best for these different locations and for showing differences. Soil survey information can be used for more specialized projects as well. For example, we can use this information to look at what some may call black soils or mollisols in U.S. soil taxonomy. The long explanation gives a lot of information about this kind of soil and where you might find it and what its properties might be. We can see here that this soil is expected to be in the U.S. and in particular located in a county in Kansas. This soil happens to be the Keith soil from the central U.S. Great Plains region. It's a dry mollisol formed in loess under short grass prairie. Project described in the previous slide, we collected a lot of soils under different management systems to see how they differ. Pedons were collected to a depth of 100 centimeters under 3 management systems. Any differences in color were very subtle, but the reference conditions for rangeland or perennial grass that were used were more likely to have black soil colors at 50 centimeters than the others. We can use DSP info to update what we know. In this simulation, the kinds of soil and the DSPs were used to show where water would go after a heavy rainstorm. Yellow is some water, and blue is a lot of water. In summary, maps tell us where things are. Soil Survey puts soil types on maps. New dynamic soil maps can give us information about changes and differences between soils. We are also able to incorporate new information into maps that can be used by stakeholders for various mapping initiatives and related projects. For more information, please visit us at www.nrcs.usda.gov.
Great talks from our two speakers, Tiffany and Sky. We will now move into our discussion session and get to as many questions as time allows. For both Tiffany and Sky, whoever wants to jump in, can you comment on the importance of communication in your work and why like community outreach with the work you do is crucial for the success of soil science?
I can start and let Tiffany jump in. In terms of, I mean, the whole point of making a soil survey is to distribute information and have something that people can use. So it's really important to us to communicate and then communicate in both directions. We want to know what our soil survey users want to know and give them that information. And then we want to tell people just what's available, because a lot of times people don't know what they can get from soil survey. And so for us, we think communication is absolutely key. And we don't know everything. We can't know all the regions, all the crops, all of the management systems, all of the problems. We have a lot of new work going on in urban areas. Tiffany mentioned coastal zone areas. I mean, these are, and we only did that because we communicated back and forth with our users.
Perfect. I'm seeing a bunch of questions start to pop up in the chat. The next question I'm seeing specifically for Tiffany, can you talk about the difference between organic soil as it pertains to soil science terminology and agricultural practices and products that are certified as organic by the USDA National Organic Program?
Okay, so that's a tough one. So I'm going to lean on Sky a little bit, but the first thing I want to point out is that the National Organic Program that you're talking about is focused a little bit more on the agricultural crops, not necessarily certifying the soil itself. And so in the video, when I'm talking about organic material in the soil, I'm talking about things that are derived from something that was once living. They're interrelated, but they're actually two different topics. And so I don't know if they could maybe clarify the question or
that is a term, it's terminology, right? Like when we're talking about organic soils or organic matter, we're actually talking about a kind of material that's carbon based. Whereas the organic program is talking about methods of management that are certified not by us, by different groups in USDA.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you for that clarification terminology, because I know especially with the soils, there's a lot of terminology for what bin everything falls in. The next question I'm seeing in the chat is, what are proxies for soil organic carbon, and are there any ways to assess soil carbon at scale?
So this is my primary area of research, so I'll start, and Tiffany, feel free to jump in. But the best way to measure soil carbon is through combustion analysis. That is, you light it on fire, see how much you get, how much of it burns off. There are several proxies, including soil color. I mean, that is a big one. Like the darker something is, the more carbon there tends to be, but that can be mediated somewhat by different mineralogies. It can be a little complicated. We have a couple of really big projects where we've assessed carbon at scale. And we've measured soil carbon in a lot of places. And because of those soil forming factors that Tiffany talked about in her presentation, we can extrapolate the points that we measure to wider areas across the country. And there's a lot of work being done by us internally, by FAO internationally, and a whole lot of groups are interested in this.
Perfect.
I'll just simply add that, I'm a researcher on Skywheels' staff, and looking at different methods and ways to assess carbon is something that we do. And so thank you for the question. And that's actually something that we're working on quite frequently on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So in our research. So yeah.
Awesome. The next topic I kind of wanted you guys to elaborate a little bit on is so I'm curious if you could elaborate on where your funding comes from for the research you do, and kind of what's like the future outlook on the funding you will receive. Like what's kind of the support you guys are getting? Are you guys working with a lot? Are you working with a little? Kind of elaborate on how that works in your line of work.
Well, we both chuckle at that because honestly, our research group, and we're a very small part of the research that goes on within USDA and certainly within the federal government. Our research mandate is really focused on soil survey, but we know that soil survey intersects with all of these other things. And, you know, to really know where something applies, you need to make a map. And soil survey is really good at that. We make great maps, and we can help get information out to people. So our research is actually pretty small scale from a monetary point of view, and we rely on our partnerships with other agencies, with universities, NGOs, other cooperators. I mean, we're always trying to build partnerships in order to get research done. So the research topics can be quite large, but our actual research footprint is pretty small.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that clarification. The next question I'm seeing in the chat geared towards Sky. Soil mapping seems really intensive. How often are the maps updated? Also, how is the sampling done in terms of proximity of frequency of samples? Is there a lot of interpolation going on?
So interpolation, yeah.
Interpolation,
We yeah, it is intensive. I mean, we are an entire division devoted to mapping soils and ecological conditions within the whole US, and it's quite a lot of people. It's a decent size overall budget, even though I said research is a small part of that. We officially, our soil survey products are updated once a year at the start of the fiscal year, and that's what the Natural Resources Conservation Service that we're a part of, that's when they update all of their, farm bill programs, any of their planning exercises. But we are continuously updating our information, updating our data sets throughout the year, and we have an internal system. You can certainly Google this, something called NASIS is where we store all this information. We have major land resource areas and soil survey offices spread across the country. They're always gathering data, making their best informed decisions, documenting what they've done according to the National Soil Survey Handbook, and that includes a lot of interpolation between points. And
Perfect.
we use, I was just going to say, we use those soil forming factors and some geostatistics to do that kind of interpolation.
Perfect.
Sorry.
And I think that I don't mean to cut anybody off. I think that perfectly segues into our next question, where is there publicly available data of recent carbon data sets, and where do people access those if they are available?
So we did something called rapid carbon assessment about 10 years ago. There have not been any dedicated efforts, although I think that there will be because of some of the partnerships and funding that has been announced recently. We will be updating those. Everything we do is publicly available as soon as it's been vetted. And so you can Google it. My email is up there. Find me and ask, and I'll get you those resources because it can be a little specific. We have something called the National, now I'm going to blank out on the name, the characterization data set, and it includes as much carbon data as we have. It's not always sold that way, but there is a lot of carbon data in there.
Perfect. The next question I'm seeing is, have you guys looked at soil NOx emissions as an artifact of fertilizer application to agricultural lands?
So I will start on this one. I think I should clarify. I'm not sure that I did a good job of clarifying like who I am and what I do. So I am a research soil scientist on SkyWill's staff, and Sky is the national leader for soil research at the center. And so there are actually several research scientists that we have on the staff. my research area is soil biology. And so most of the research that, or things that we look at related to soil biology, are things that I would be involved in directly. Um, we do have several other scientists and, hydrologists and mappers and data scientists that look at all other areas of research. And so looking at, greenhouse gas emissions is certainly something that we're interested in. And we are getting set up to do some of that as well in our lab. But I have not personally looked at any of those greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, so the Agricultural Research Service has the bulk of the USDA mandate to look into NOx emissions and all greenhouse gas emissions, really, although we try to coordinate and try to say something about making sure everything gets measured, so we can make a map about it. And that's another thing that you're going to see more on. There's something called a Comet Farm, and that is the official NRCS way to account for these things, because as I'm sure you guys know, it's more than just what's happening in the soil. We really want it to be a whole system.
Perfect. The next question I'm seeing in the chat, is there a citizen science component of your work? By analogy, the National Weather Service depends a lot on members of the public who agree to collect rainfall data regularly. Is there a similar role for the public when it comes to soils?
That we've talked about that and how to do it, and there has been some work in the past, because soil measurements tend to be so intensive and so specific. We have something called the National Cooperative Soil Survey, which largely includes big other agencies, universities, sometimes state entities that are collecting this stuff. And we certainly would be interested in collaborating with citizen science groups, but I don't think we have anything formally set up. It's mostly been on kind of, I guess, ad hoc. Like, as people are interested, we work on it, and we've never really been able to get it to get the data standards up to where it's helpful for us and for other people to use. Right?
Yeah, no, thanks for the clarification. The next question I'm seeing is, are there additional types of information you think would be good to add to the soil survey data sets? If so, what types of questions, research would those additional data types help you address?
Well, one thing we're definitely going to add is that stuff that was mentioned about, like state and transition models, multiple possible reference conditions, and things about possible biodiversity and soil biology information that isn't currently in soil survey. I don't know, Tiffany, do you want to tell us a little bit about that kind of new information?
Yes. So I'm really excited to see this question, because this is my thing, right? So one of the things that I am looking forward to working on, that we've already gotten started on, there's a lot of interest right now in soil biodiversity. And so we are looking at kind of adapting some of the methods that are out there for adding some of that biological information to soil survey. And so I'm starting with looking at some genetics and genomics type work, seeing what those microbial communities look like. Most of my PhD work was in soil microbial ecology. We've also kind of tinkered around with looking at nematodes, looking at earthworm casts, and how we can map some of those things as well. And so we're hoping that using some of these biological methods and gathering some of that information and incorporating it into soil survey will really help elucidate some of the issues that we have with production, and help us provide better information and a more complete picture to our stakeholders.
Perfect. I'm seeing that the next question is asking who's in charge of updating and changing this web soil survey tool functionalities. I have some questions and suggestions for this team relative to the needs of my state agency.
So I was actually just responding to this, but it'll be faster for me to just say it. So there is a group updating web soil survey right now, and it's a different part of the National Soil Survey Center. It's called Soil Business Systems. If you send me something, I can get you in touch with them, or I encourage you to reach out to your state soil scientist, which every state has a state soil scientist that is the liaison to the Soil Survey and National Soil Survey Center. So we really appreciate input. Right now, we're doing some internal testing on what they've done. You may be able to get on a list through your state soil scientist of testers of this next version coming out, and that would be a great opportunity to give us some feedback.
Perfect. I'm seeing a question asking, does organic matter increase water holding capacity in the soil much?
So I can start with this one. So one thing that I like to say first and foremost to anyone that asks any sort of question related to agriculture is the answer to everything is it depends. In general, if we're just looking at general concepts, organic matter increases water holding capacity by, once you add that organic material, it helps to kind of create some more of that pore space in the soil. That organic material provides enzymes and other sorts of secretions from the living organisms that are there that help to aggregate the soil, which is what creates that pore space and allows that water to infiltrate and be held there. Now, when I say it depends, each soil is unique. And so it's really going to be situational. It's going to depend on what soil type, what's your climate, what type of organic matter do you have. And so there's so many moving parts to that it's hard to give a direct answer. And so that's what I mean by it depends. But in general, the scientific community, I would say, agrees that organic matter tends to increase water holding capacity. Sky, did you want to?
Well, I would say it increases water holding capacity within a limited range, right? And so there are some, and it depends. That's always the answer with every soil question because it is so variable. It depends. It depends on where you're starting from. In general, I think kind of like what Tiffany said, the more organic matter you have, it tends to improve other things about the soil that actually will increase actual water storage, maybe not necessarily the water holding capacity, but it depends. It always depends.
The next comment I'm seeing is actually something that also relates to a question I had started my notes. I'm seeing they're commenting on the effect of forest fires making soils hydrophobic and that having an effect on the potential for debris flows. And the question is asking, do these dynamic changes get reflected on your maps? And I guess something that I was going to ask in general is, do like natural disasters and climate change, I'm guessing these dynamic changes that can happen to the soil, how is that data like modeled or incorporated in the maps and kind of the work you guys produce?
So what tends to happen in these evolving situations is that people use soil survey as a base map and use the information on soil texture and mineralogy to then feed into process models or updated response models. We've not really tried to put those into soil survey because that hydrophobicity after fire, for instance, we have a few cooperative research projects, including one in northern Arizona. We have a couple in California where they're specifically looking at how soil properties change over time. And one issue that we're not sure how to deal with, and this comes back to the whole dynamic, like how do we make this dynamic, is that hydrophobicity is not permanent. It's a temporary thing that happens as those volatile hydrocarbons change after the wildfire, after some weathering, after things start to grow and new organic matter comes in. It's really where you are in that time series really affects how things happen. And so we're researching it. They're not exactly reflected in our maps, but we try to make our maps useful for other people who want to make predictions about that.
Perfect. Thanks for the clarification. The next thing I had in my notes is it's obvious that there's different extents and different areas to which humans impact the soil formation and the soil sustainability. From your research that you've seen in your areas, where have you seen the biggest changes in humans impacting the soil, and where do you kind of see smaller changes? I guess I'm curious like how the changes are kind of like I know it's a big question, but like kind of like where you see like the different distributions of like where there's big impacts and smaller impacts.
I can start. I mean, wow, to me, we change everything. Everything changes everything, and it depends. I think about, I went to grad school in Iowa, and we think of Iowa as these big, deep mollisols, and they're wonderful. But when you look at many agricultural fields, you can actually see what we call like the white knobs, where there are shoulders that have been eroded. And most of the soil is still the way we think of it in our conceptual models, but a lot of it has just drastically been altered by the things that have been done to it in the past, recent past, within the last 150 years. We've made some pretty massive changes. And anytime you go from one land use to another, you're totally changing all of the organisms, and you're changing just everything. So it's really variable, but I think Tiffany might be able to speak to things that happen at much smaller scales, which are maybe not visually as dramatic, but are as important.
Yeah, the way I was going to go with that question is I go back to my general answer of it depends. Depends on what we're talking about, because I'm speaking from the expert or the area of biology, so just from that lens. But it depends on land use. What did we change, and how drastic was that change? Which organisms are we talking about here? If we're talking about microbes, it depends on what it was that was changed, and how that community is able to respond. When we're talking about things on that small of a scale, it depends is probably the right answer, because, and what I mean by it depends is not only are we considering those external factors, maybe something we as humans changed, but, the lifespan of microbes, I mean, they reproduce on a span of hours. And so, something as simple as, the dry conditions of the last couple days can totally, change that community. If we change the microbial community, and then we're going to, okay, now what can they offer with their function? If we've changed the community, are they still cycling the nutrients the same way that they were? Are they still, providing what we need for some of our crops? How are the fungi affected? Are they still able to gather the nutrients and have those symbiotic relationships with rooting systems? And so I don't know that there's a real answer besides it depends.
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
that's fine. Thanks for expanding the context of that. And I just see we got some fresh questions in the chat. What's the maximum TPA carbon that soil may take up excluding crops?
I'm not sure what TPA is, but in general, so it's really complicated. It does depend, and it depends on the time frame. Like, you can add a lot of carbon to crops, you can add a lot of carbon through compost, through biochar, through manure, but you're only going to change things for a while, and it tends to come back to some sort of stasis. That you're gonna hate us all. You're gonna hate me and Tiffany for saying this to you over and over again, but it totally depends. But different soils have different amounts. It depends on the climate. It depends on past and future climate. And so sometimes we have to think about not only what's happening right now, but what we think is going to be happening in the near future. So it's really hard to say. We are working on some ways of predicting what's possible, but it's an open area of research.
Perfect. Yeah, and we have a clarification in the chat of TPA being tons per acre. Yep.
Okay.
Then it depends is definitely the right answer.
Yeah. Sorry for it depends, but it's totally true.
No, all good. The next topic I'm seeing is a question relating to are soils better or worse than they were pre-agricultural times, and also in terms of like water quality you see. How have you kind of seen like the quality of soil change over time?
That's another one of those questions that I have to ask more questions before I can answer it. So another one of those, it depends. Like, where are we talking about? Like, what's the location that you're asking me about? You know, are you saying pre-agricultural soils, you know, maybe in Kansas? Are we talking about pre-agricultural soils where? Water quality also where? Are we talking about uh, that's a tough one. I don't know that
I mean,
I
that is
have an
really
answer.
tough, and it depends on, pre-agricultural. And of course, our part of our research focus and the constraints of we're working in the world, we don't really think about pre-agricultural very much because, we have agriculture and we're just trying to do the best we can. And I think we've made some improvements over my career, not as many as we might have hoped in some areas. So that one is super tough, and you almost have to get into like the geoarchaeology side of it, like thinking about some work we've done in the Eastern Shore and how clearance of virgin forest probably completely changed like what was land and what was water, and it can just be really localized and really kind of what's better. I yeah, I don't have a good answer for that, and certainly not on a big scale. Just that's a really local question.
Perfect. To paraphrase the next question we have, how can members of the public be part of solutions with respect to soils? What's kind of the takeaways for how the public can be part of maintaining these sustainable soils that are ideal for what we want?
Yeah, I think I summed it up pretty good in the slides. You know, there are just some basic soil health principles that you can follow that would improve the situation. And certainly if we could get the general public to consider that. So, you know, making sure that, you know, you keep the soil covered, you know, so that you don't have bare soil. When you have bare soil, of course, it's more susceptible to erosion and those types of things. Um, One thing that you could do is if you're unsure about something with your soil, ask someone. There's NRCS people you can ask. There's local extension people that are willing to help you. I think that's one thing. A lot of these questions that I'm seeing come up, as Scott mentioned, the last one is kind of a localized thing, but there are people that could help better answer those for your local soils. And so if you have questions about how to care for them, check in with extension, check in with your local NRCS offices. But yeah, just general soil health things. Keep that soil covered, maximize biodiversity, take care of them. Try not to disturb them as much. Sky?
I would come at this from a much bigger picture in terms of if you really want to help and make a difference, it's keep soils a part of the conversation. We tend to not be a sexy science. We're, out of view. People don't think about us. We don't get the exposure that NASA or NOAA or some of our any of our colleagues get. And so just keep the focus on soil and think about how big the impacts of agriculture are, and really, to do this, to manage the world well, we have to get a handle on soil, and that's it's not always easy to sell to people if they're not thinking about it.
No, perfect. And then from the soil survey data you guys have collected so far, have you seen changes in the agricultural practices and land use that have increased the soil biodiversity, quality, water capacity? Are there areas that have changed more within the US versus other areas?
So we have a sister group called Resource Inventory and Assessment Division, and they run our Conservation Effects Assessment Program, and they would be better positioned to answer that. So I encourage you to look out. I mean, there have been differences. There have been areas that have been focused of some special initiatives that I think have really moved forward more than other areas. But I hesitate to say because I don't know that I have the full picture of that. So I encourage you to look for those groups.
Perfect. The next question I'm seeing is, do you look into pesticide effects on soil health at all? Does the EPA seek your input on how microorganisms might respond to these sorts of biochemical tools?
Tiffany is actually at the forefront of this. In the past, we've not looked into this. Pesticides, I haven't done any specific work. EPA does really do most of that work, but we inform them about what different soils they need to think about and different variability that they may need to incorporate into their research. Do you?
No, I was going to say, that type of thing is a little bit outside the realm of my particular area of research and what I'm doing for soil survey. However, as Sky mentioned earlier, that our research partners at ARS tend to focus a little bit more on those specific issues. And certainly, we do collaborate across agencies, across the government, if there is some need or some particular issue that we can be that we can provide expert assistance with.
Perfect.
But
Awesome.
yeah.
Oh no. The next question I'm seeing is, what programs are you implementing to develop urban agriculture with topics such as hydroponics and aquaponics?
So, well, once you get into hydroponics and aquaponics, we're kind of out, right? But for the urban stuff, and I shouldn't say that, because we have a coastal zone soil survey that actually works on these kind of interpretations. There's something called coastal zone focus team, and we have focus teams that work on these, and I encourage you to Google it. I didn't think to put it in the chat, but I should have. We have an urban soil survey group, and we have done urban soil surveys in multiple places. We're working on assisting people with what to look for in terms of soil health and just management decisions in, say, urban gardens. Urban agriculture is a huge focus of NRCS, and we support that to the extent we can.
Perfect. And then a question I had for you guys is, to what extent do you plan on engaging directly with schools and teachers to make your research part of your fields, like overarching, like geoscience education? Like, do you guys take any of these materials you share with us and use them for like kind of public outreach with schools and education?
I have done that personally on a really small basis, and we serve on like the Soil Science Society of America. Like, we assist with that. We've kind of let them take the lead because of the national footprint. And teachers have standards they need to be, and we want to be helpful. We don't want to dictate to them what we think they should be teaching.
Perfect. And then one last question I have before we're out of time is, I remember on your chart you mentioned that the soil is approximately like 5% organics, like in terms of like the percent composition. What percent organics from your research have you seen is like for the most like ideal soil in like your region? Because I know it depends like what soil you're talking about, but at least the soils you focus on, like what kind of percent organics are you looking at where the organics are like beneficial?
So I'm sorry to take this back to our answer of it depends.
Yeah.
But when you say what soils we focus on, so we are located at the National Soil Survey Center. And so I don't necessarily, even though I'm located maybe here in the Midwest, I don't necessarily focus only on soils here in the Midwest because we're the national center. So we are charged with making sure that we're doing research that applies to the whole country. And so it depends on which soils you're talking about. Are we talking about my work with soils down in Louisiana? Are we talking about my work with soils in the Midwest? Are we talking about the soils that I get questions about out of West Virginia? So it just really, there's no particular, it just depends on the soil. But those numbers that are used in that pie chart, just in general, come from averages that are seen, the same numbers you would see like in typical soils publications, soils textbooks. So those are averages and general numbers, but it really depends on which soils you're talking about and where.
No, perfect. Thanks for the clarification. That was my question. That's about all we have time for today. If you have any questions that were not addressed today, you can email us at webinars@americangeosciences.org, and we'll make sure to send those along to our speakers. Thanks again to our speakers, Tiffany and Sky. This webinar concludes the Earth Science Week webinar series for 2022. If you visit our webpage at www.americangeosciences.org/webinars, you'll be able to find all this week's webinars available online by the end of next week. Take care, everybody. Thank you.